this paper. This paper is entitled "The Long-Lasting Scar of Bad Jobs in the Spanish Labor Markets," and it's a paper that I've done together with Lucía Gorjón, Sara de la Rica, who is also present here, and Antonio Villar. We've done it from Fundación ISEAK, which is a research institute located in Bilbao, and Antonio comes from Universidad Pablo de Olavide in Seville in the south of Spain. This project has been done in the framework of Co-work for Youth, which is a project in the framework of the EEA and Norway grants that I'll mention a bit later, what the project is all about. So just to give you a bit of introduction,
the only thing is, in principle, Ainhoa is going to present. If any of you have some doubts, you can just raise your hand, and then I will try to interrupt Ainhoa, because, you know, so as she's not looking at hands. If not, then we'll have the discussion afterwards, if you like.
Yes, exactly. So feel free to interrupt. So in what we do in this paper is we analyze the quality of jobs in Spain of the youth. This is a topic of increasing concern, and notably in the Spanish case, where we have very high unemployment rates, which are around 40% for the youth. We have a very high rate of temporary jobs, over 21%, which is almost twice the EU average. Then we have high elasticity of employment to the cycle. So this makes firing and hiring the main adjustment variables, meaning that in economically booming periods, a lot of employment is created, but in economically depressing periods, really a lot of employment is destroyed. Then we have a large share of undesired part-time jobs, which are mostly undertaken by women. And it's something that also affects the quality of jobs, is the seasonal nature of some of our sectors, like reliance on hospitality or agrofishing. Though we should note that one of the main problems of our labor market is the high rate of temporary jobs, which is also affecting, of course, a lot those kind of sectors like hospitality. But we should note that this is a problem that kind of applies to all the sectors in Spain, and not only hospitality or agrofishing. So with this context in mind, we have two research questions. What we do here is we measure the quality of jobs of workers on 3 points in time. So in their first working year, in the 5th working year, and then their 10th working year, as you can see in this illustration. We say the first year, but it's actually the second, because we want to avoid some potential employment spells of people who are just finishing their studies. So we say first year, but it's actually the second. And then we also analyze the quality of jobs in the 5th year and the 10th year. So with this in mind, the first question that we want to address is, how does job precariousness at present mark workers' labor trajectories in the future? So does the fact that I'm in a bad job at present, will that affect my future labor outcomes? This is known in the literature as the scarring effect, and we'll refer to this very often throughout this presentation. The second question is related. So if we do find evidence of scarring effects, we want to know what aspects of precariousness are driving this effect. So for example, is it that people are earning very low hourly wages that is kind of explaining the scarring effect? Is it that they work very few hours per year that is driving this effect? Or is it that there's high rotation, so that workers sign a lot of contracts, which is usually a proxy of unstable jobs? Okay, so these are our two main research questions here. Just to give you some background and literature, so the first thing that we want to reflect on is precariousness an entrance fee, or is it a trap, right? Because the fact that many individuals start their employment career with temporary or unstable contracts, and those usually involve relatively low wages. So when productivity is rebuilt as time goes by and seniority is gained, it is supposed, right, that initial conditions might improve. So in this sense, if the low quality of jobs really happens at the initial phase, this can be regarded as an entrance fee. So like a toll, right? But this would mean that starting the work experience with a bad job could be kind of acceptable. as long as it's a transitory situation, so something that will improve as time goes by. But the question is whether this is actually the case, or whether conversely an initial bad job may become a trap for the future, as suggested in the literature. There's a wide range of literature on the scarring effects in the labor market context. For example, Dolado and authors found that entering the labor market during a recession period has long-term effects on wages and might also affect other aspects of life, as I will explain shortly. But however, very few papers integrate a measure of precariousness in a sole dimension. There are some exceptions, of course. So the literature that actually does tackle with precariousness, they find in general 3 main components that can explain precariousness. One is working few hours, the other is having low hourly wages, and the other is having high rotation. And those could be regarded as the 3 main dimensions. Okay, and why are these 3 dimensions? So starting with wages and working low intensity, we see that low levels of labor income, so because either there are low wages or because people work few hours, this reduces consumption and saving possibilities. And this might have effects in very important things like access to housing or credit, and this can hamper intertemporal substitution, among other implications that might go beyond just economics, like having children, health status, marriage, etc. Also, the number of contracts signed is an important variable. This is often used as a proxy of the stability of the job, which is an element that also affects decisions on the future by households. For example, changing employers hinders future planning and involves transition costs. And even if people stay within the same employer, signing a lot of contracts, so changing very often contracts, might give a bad signal to the labor market, because there might be disincentives between the 2 parties to reach an agreement as to the type of contract to be undertaken. So what's the added value of our paper, which is shown here on the left? Well, the first thing is that we do include a measure that integrates the different dimensions of precariousness into a single indicator. So we combine these hourly wages, hours, and rotation of workers into a single indicator. We also want to identify which of those 3 dimensions of precariousness might be driving a scarring effect, if this actually happens. We also analyze the relationship between precariousness and other variables like sector, gender, educational level, region, etc. And we also want to know what's the role of the economic cycle in explaining the scar of bad jobs in the medium and long term. Any questions, feel free to interrupt. So now regarding the database, we use a very rich database that is available in Spain. It's called Continuous Sample of Working Histories. It's an administrative database from the Spanish Social Security, which provides full records of workers' labor trajectories. So it represents around 4% of total workers in Spain. From those, we choose individuals who enter the labor market at the age of between 16 and 30 years old for the first time, and we analyze them 1 year later, 5 years later, and 10 years later. Okay, so we actually take individuals who enter the labor market between 1997 and 2013, so that we can analyze the impact at least 5 years later. This is why the 2013 is in there. So how do we define bad jobs? So as you know, there's no universal definition of precariousness or bad jobs, etc. So what we do here is we construct an index, which is a standard Cobb-Douglas function, to measure the utility that a job provides to a given worker depending on their labor conditions. This utility index depends positively on hourly wages and hours worked, and negatively on number of contracts signed. So as I mentioned before, the number of contracts signed is a proxy of instability, and this is why it depends negatively. And on the other hand, hourly wages are positively related to this utility index. And then I wanted to note as well that the hours worked, if a person doesn't work the maximum amount of hours that is kind of legal or established for a given year, this includes if someone doesn't do it, that means that person was for some time either in potential unemployment spells or non-employment spells, or in part-time job spells. Okay, so this is something to note as well. So what we do is we create this utility index for a given individual in our database for each of the years that we analyze. The thing is, once we calculate this index for each of the individuals, how do we establish if that person was in a bad job or not? What do we do? What criteria do we use? So in this case, what we do is we need to have a reference value to compare this quality index to, and we follow the poverty literature. So what we do is we take the whole employed population in Spain in 2007, which was an economically booming period, and we calculate the quality index for this index that I mentioned for each of the workers in the database. So the threshold is established as the 60% of the median of the distribution of this utility index for the overall employed population in Spain in 2007. And I also wanted to know that we do some robustness checks so that to ensure that this point doesn't create any bias. We have that also in our paper, and also regarding the functional form of the index here, you see the square root, but we also do some other robustness checks to see that our results are robust. Okay, so this is the idea behind our utility index. Then regarding the empirical approach, so in our dependent variable is a dummy variable that takes value 1 if the person is in a bad job in T+5, so in the medium term, or that's the first model. And on the second model, it is a dummy variable that takes value 1 if the person was in a bad job in the long term. Okay, so we have like two models for these different periods of time. So we also control for the covariates that I mentioned before, like gender or sector, etc. And it's important to note that because we had 2 research questions, we have a couple different models. So the first question, just to refresh our minds, was how does job precariousness mark workers' labor trajectories? So is there evidence of scarring effects? So in this case, Z is just a dummy variable that takes value 1 if the person was in the past in a bad job. So when we are analyzing the impact, the medium term scar, this variable would include whether the person was in a bad job in T+1, okay? And when we are analyzing the long-term scar, so when our dependent variable is T+10, this Z would be a dummy for whether the person was in a bad job according to our utility index in T+5 and in T+1 respectively. So this is based purely on the index, and the index gives rise to this dummy variable, okay? And the second question is, if there's evidence of a scarring effect, what aspects of precariousness drive this effect? So in this case, Z includes the separate components of the utility index. This is because we want to know which of the 3 different elements of precariousness are driving the scar, okay? So here we divide into 4 different categories, each of these three dimensions. So hourly wages, we create 4 groups, and those 4 groups are just defined as per the quartile distribution of 2007, just to have a reference. Then for the number of hours, we take into account whether the individual in that given year was working the equivalent to full time. So it's actually calculated in hours, but we say here months just to make it more like visual or more understandable. So the 4 groups are if the individual was working less than 3 months in that given year, between 3 and 6 months, between 6 and 11, and over 11 months per year. And lastly, regarding the number of contracts, we also create this for groups, which are whether the person was signed in the past 4 contracts or more, 3 contracts, 2 contracts, or 1 contract. Okay. So then something that we noticed when analyzing data is that some of the individuals that we had in our database that showed up in T+1, so in the first working year, then they disappear from the labor market after 5 years. So it seems that the probability of leaving the labor market is linked to the quality of the job, because basically what we saw is that those entering the labor market with work jobs exhibit higher chances of disappearing from the database. And disappearing from the database means that that person is no longer with any affiliation to the Social Security. So this means that there's a non-random nature of those individuals who leave the labor markets, and there might be selection bias that we try to overcome by the Heckman two-step procedure. Just to show you some results of the descriptive analysis, this first flowchart that I'm going to show shows between the period, so for the entrants that we considered who started working in Spain between 1997 and 2013, we show overall what's the proportion of people who start, so whose first year includes a bad quality job, okay, out of the total. So we see that 66%, so 2 in every 3 young Spaniards, start their working career in bad jobs. But what happens 5 years later? So we see, as expected in this flowchart, we see a reduction. So as you can see in the pink bar, 37% of Spaniards are in bad jobs on their 5th working year. So it's a reduction. And something important to note is that most of those who are in bad jobs 5 years later were also in bad jobs at the start of their career. Okay, and then we see on the blue bar, we see some missings, which is what I was mentioning before. So some individuals disappearing from the database, and we see that most of them are from those who had bad jobs at the start. And what happens in T+10, so this is the longer term, we see that, of course, there's a big reduction in the proportion of people who are in bad jobs in Spain. So young people who are not so young anymore, there's 26% of them are in bad jobs. So of course, this is a reduction, but still 1 in every 4 Spaniards are in bad jobs, even after gaining seniority or more experience. In the paper, you can also find this per year. So more the dynamic part of it, but I skipped it here for simplicity. Okay, so now that we've seen this, so this, as you can infer, this is just purely based on the index. So whether a person was in a bad job or not, based on the index that we created. Now we are going to move on, and we are going to introduce some dynamics on the one hand. So we are going to show the evolution over time. And on the other hand, we are going to show the different components of the precariousness index and what's their weight for the Spanish youth. Okay, so this is what we are going to do right now. Okay, so here we are showing the share of workers who are in different wage ranges. So in pink, you can see the proportion of people who earn below 6.7 euros. In gray, you can see those who earn between 6.7 and 8.7 euros, then between 8.7 and 12.8 and over that, okay? And in the horizontal axis, it's important to note that it's the entry year to the labor market. So this is like the generation that entered into the labor market in that year. Okay, and this is going to be shown like this in all the graphs that I'm going to show in a minute. So what do we see? The first thing is that we see that over 70% or close to 70% in some cases of young Spaniards in their first working year, they are earning below 8.7 euros per hour. This is in 2015 real terms, just to note. What happens 5 years later? So 5 years later, we see a quite cyclical, a cyclical component, because we see that those entering during the recession period, so 2008, there's a high share of them who 5 years later are earning below 6.7 euros per hour. And over the longer term, this share decreases, but still there are like 40% of the people who are earning below 8.7 euros per hour. Turning to the second component. The second component is the number of hours worked, which we also refer to as working intensity. And here we see as well a quite interesting pattern. So in pink, you can see those who work less than the equivalent to 3 months per year in full-time terms. And we see that there's been an increase in share of people who are working less than 3 months per year in their first year of work or working experience. As time goes by, of course, this, as we saw before, gets reduced. But for example, if we check those working over 11 months, there's been a overall decrease in share of people who are working over 11 months, so practically the whole year. And something similar can be seen for those in the 10th year of working experience. So we see that, of course, after 10 years, there's an important share of people who work practically the whole year, but still there's a very important part of those who don't. And then turning.
Sorry, I think there is a question. Miss Eva is raising her hand.
Sorry, yes, thank you. I'm sorry, my camera is broken. I just have a clarification question with regard to the, because I can see that in 10th year, it ends with 2008. Is it an error or is it a, no, okay.
No, thank you for your question. No, in the 10th year, so in the horizontal axis, we are showing the entry year to the labor market. So it's people who entered the labor market in 2008.
Okay.
We are analyzing them 10 years later.
Okay. Thank
you.
So
it's actually 2018. Okay. So you have to add those.
Okay. Thank you.
We did this just to be able to compare like across the same cohort in the different graphs.
Sure. Thank you.
No problem. Okay. So now we are going to go to the empirical results. Sorry, I'm going to take some water. Okay, so regarding the empirical results, the first question was, do bad jobs leave a scar in the future labor trajectories? Just to recap a bit on the model that we saw before, in order to measure the probability that someone is over the long term, so 10 years later, in a precarious situation. Sorry, just to note that we are going to show the results for the long term, but we also have results for the medium term available in the report. But if we like, it would be too much to show both. So here in the first question, where we wanted to see if there's a scarring effect, just that what we do is Z is a dummy variable to measure whether the individual was in a bad labor situation in T+5 and T+1 respectively. Sorry, so it should be T+1 respectively. So this is just based on the quality of jobs index, okay? And we are going to show here the results. So this is going to show the marginal probability of being in a precarious job 10 years after starting the working career. So there's a lot of text, but just focusing on the first model, we are not showing the covariates. Those can be found in the report in the appendix, but we are showing the coefficients of the variables of interest. So what determines a bad job in the medium term, right? What we see here is two coefficients, being in a bad job in the past at the initial moment of the working year or in the medium term. So the first thing that we should, or the first message is that really the magnitude of the coefficient is a lot higher for T+5 as compared to T+1. This means that the scar left by bad jobs in the medium term, rather than at the start, is the key determinant of bad jobs in the long term. So those holding bad jobs in the 5th year have a significantly higher probability of staying in such jobs in the long term. Also, just to kind of help kind of interpretation, this 0.22 coefficient here that we see is that workers in bad jobs in the medium term have a 22 percentage points higher probability of being in a precarious job in the long term compared to workers who were not in that situation. So if workers not involved in precarious jobs in the medium term, if workers they were not involved in bad jobs in the medium term, the probability of precariousness is around 15%. So this is the predicted probability, as you can see in the very last row. However, if they were actually in bad jobs, their probability would increase up to 37%, which gives rise to this scar of 22 percentage points. Okay, I hope this is clear. It's a bit messy to explain this, but if I think there are economists here, so for those who are not or need clarification, do not hesitate to let us know. Okay, so now turning to, again, the recap of the model, we want to answer to the second question, which is if there's evidence of a scarring effect, what aspects of precariousness drive the effect? So remember before we were taking into account whether the person was in a bad job or not according to the utility index. So in the past, but what we do now is, as we want to know what different dimensions of precariousness are driving these effects, we separate the components of the utility index. So hourly wages, hours worked, and number of contracts. Those are divided into 4 different categories, as I showed in the graph before. So hourly wages are defined as per the quartile distribution of 2007, number of hours by those 4 different groups that we saw before, and number of contracts, so 4 or more than 4, 3 contracts, 2 contracts, or 1 contract. Okay, and again, the dependent variable is the same as before, so it's a dummy variable that takes value 1 if the person is in a bad job in the long term, versus value 0 if that person is not. So I'm going to show the results now. So it's model 2, what we see here, and the main message here is that working few hours 5 years after entering the labor market has a very strong effect on the quality of job in the long term. So you can see, for example, that having a very low wage has a scar or implies a scar of 0.23%, so 23 percentage points. Low wages in the medium term do affect the likelihood of bad jobs in the long term, but to a lesser extent. The scar I was mentioning before is 28 percentage points, and very low wages is 23 percentage points. And then having more than 3 contracts within the 5th working year does not entail a very large scar over the longer term. Also, as we saw before, so in the second part of the table, so where you see the blue square from then onwards, this relates to T+5, whereas what's above that is T+1, and it's very noteworthy that the T+1 coefficients, their magnitude is a lot lower, which is similar as what we saw before when we just were taking the dummy variable of whether the person was in a bad job or not in the past according to our index. Okay, so the message is reinforced that it's really the medium term that is marking this long-term effect of precariousness. And then there are some other aspects that we take into account. So we take into account some covariates, and I'm going to briefly explain the results of these covariates. So remember the first model and the second models are the one I just explained, and of course in both of them we control for different covariates. I'm just going to very briefly comment on the results. The first thing is that we consider the age at entry. Unfortunately, the database doesn't have information on educational level, so we use this as a proxy. And we see that the younger the age at entry, the higher is the probability of incurring precarious jobs. This is something that we would have expected. Then for gender, we see that in both cases, female workers are more prone to labor precariousness. So the sign of the scar is positive, meaning that over the long term, female workers have a higher chance of incurring precarious jobs compared to male workers. And lastly, we also take into account the sector that workers were involved in the past, so in the 5th working year in this case. And we see that construction and hospitality sectors, together with agri-fishing, leave a deeper scar in future precariousness when we compare them to other sectors like education or industry. This is also in line with what one might have expected. And lastly, this is the last part of the results where we do the same, where we do regressions, but in this case, we want to see whether the economic cycle has an impact on the magnitude of the scar. So we do the same model as model 1, but we do it annually. And here I'm going to show you the coefficients of the scar for T+1 and T+5. Okay, so in gray, you can see the scar of bad jobs at entry, so in T+1, and in pink, you can see the scar of bad jobs in the 5th year. The first thing to note again is that we see that it's really the medium term that marks this long-term precariousness. This is on the one hand, and on the other hand, we see that the magnitude of the scar has increased overall over time. And for example, if we focus on the 2008 cohort, so the cohort that entered the labor market in that year, we see that the scar is 24 percentage points. If we again look at the predicted probability, which makes it easy to understand the meaning of this scar, we see that the predicted probability of being in bad jobs in T+10 for those who were not in bad jobs in the past is 14%. But in contrast, for those who were in the past in bad jobs in the medium term, this probability predicted is of the order of 38%. So this difference is the scar that we are showing here. Okay, so this is in the report, we have an appendix with all the predicted probabilities, and we see that those entering during depressing periods in the labor market have nearly sometimes double chances of incurring bad jobs in the future. Just to conclude on some policy recommendations, we've seen that bad jobs become sticky, so workers starting in precarious jobs will likely continue those in medium term, but if they are able to escape those jobs in the medium term, like precariousness, they will be able to kind of be free from precariousness over the longer term. We see that working intensity is key. So this is the key determinant to medium and long-term precariousness. So working few hours per year, either because of part-time jobs or because non-employment spells, really marks workers' labor trajectories. We've seen also that entering the market in economically depressing periods doubles sometimes workers' chances of incurring precarious jobs. It should be noted that crises then affect not only workers present, but also the future of new entrants. And we've also identified some vulnerable groups that are more prone to precariousness, like women or people in specific sectors, like, for example, hospitality. Then we have a couple of policy recommendations. The first is to have preventive policies for vulnerable groups through guidance and effective training sessions from public employment services, target early school leavers, which is also a big problem in Spain, and reduce occupational segregation. So the gender gap is in a way explained by the existing occupational segregation, and this should be overcome from the very start of the educational career choice, where there's still a big gender bias. So for example, in STEM related studies. And just to give you a very short summary of what the project is all about that we are involved in. This is a co-work for youth is an analysis and research project that has the aim of increasing knowledge on the impact of existing policies and offer some policy suggestions to enhance youth employment opportunities in less developed EEA regions. And this is funded through the EEA and Norway grants. I've also left here some links in case anyone is interested. And I would like to thank you all for your attention.